Would you pray with me a moment? Open my lips that my mouth might show forth your praise. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Authentic Christian spirituality is totally insane for many modern people. The idea of Palm Sunday and Holy Week, which is the fulcrum of Christian spirituality, the idea that God would intentionally undergo pain and rejection and death. And it was not an accident or mistake, but Jesus' choice to do this thing. And doing it without the 2020 hindsight of 2,000 years of knowing about the Easter resurrection, of intentionally suffering, of embracing the hard places of life, rather than doing what we would want to do, the smart, modern, thoughtful thing, which would be, of course, to engineer or otherwise devise a way out of the problem, an escape hatch, if you would. And if that didn't work, just run away or hide. Just be happy. Everything is rosy. That spirituality makes sense to us. This Christian spirituality, however, may seem insane. But if we live our lives trying to find a way out of them, trying to find an escape hatch, running away, just insisting that we're happy all the time, will be of no help to us when the rubber hits the road in our lives. They will leave us completely unprepared for the reality of our lives, unable to cope with reality when it comes our way. In truth, my friends, the Christian spirituality of the cross is the only medicine for what really ails us and afflicts us, because, like it or not, all of us are mortal and human. One of my favorite Christian writers is a Quaker named Parker Palmer, and he writes that the spiritual life is about becoming more at home in our skin. The spiritual life is about becoming more at home in our skin. And following up on that, a man named Mark Nepo writes, anything that removes what grows between our hearts and the day is spiritual. Becoming at home in our skin, removing what stands between our heart and the day, that's spirituality. And let's be honest, all of us are totally at home in our skin and happy to uncover our hearts when everything's beautiful, when it's all raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, brown paper packages, warm woolen mittens, cream-colored ponies and crisp apple strudels. You know, when Julie Andrews sings that song to the children, Our Favorite Things. We love those days, and we're totally open to those times in our lives when it's like that. But what about all the other times? What about the times in our lives that scare us? The times in our lives that hurt us and scar us? And if we don't keep practicing the way of the cross, can keep us from ever being able to enjoy the good times again. All the things that go on in the world all around us, car bombings of churches and mosques, people starving. It is the practice of Christian spirituality during Holy Week, but not just during Holy Week, because if you think about Jesus' life and read the Gospels, he spent most of his time in ministry with people in trauma, people in physical trauma, with disabilities, emotional trauma, being unable to get their spirits right, social trauma, having been cast out of their society, spiritual trauma, feeling far from God. But it's especially true during Holy Week, this entering into the suffering of life, and trusting, as the Apostle Paul says in the letter to the Romans, that all things work for the good for those who love God. Trusting that to see you into it so that you might come out the other side. Now, last weekend, we went to New York City, and I experienced Palm Sunday a week early in a whole new way than I ever had before, because we went to see the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, where the World Trade Centers used to stand. And for those of you who were alive on that day, it was heartbreaking and beautiful and moving. And I had the most intense experience of being right back where I was when that happened all those years ago. And I found myself sitting in the memorial room listening to the stories, to the actual recordings of people calling their loved ones from the plane to tell them what was happening and that they loved them and they would see them in the future. And then there was another section where it was telling the stories of the firefighters and the police officers and the EMTs and the good citizens who went up inside the towers to try to save people, knowing that they might die and that they in fact did lose their lives. It's what, I'm quoting a lot of people today, and they're all of my favorites. Now I turn to Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers used to teach on his show. When something bad happened, he said, "My mother told me to always look for the helpers when there's a disaster, when there's a tragedy, that they help us understand what's good in this." And those firefighters and those police officers and those EMTs and those local citizens who went up and lost their lives gave meaning to that disaster, which was meant to be only a sign of hatred and violence, like the cross outside the wall of Jerusalem with a body hanging on it. Sitting in that underground museum in New York, where it could have been total darkness, I saw great light. And my friends, this isn't just a travel log about us in New York. We can apply this to our lives. If we think about all the bad things in our lives, and we think about the ways that we try to find escape hatches, and we try to want to run away, and we try to do the great Yankee thing, which is to put it in a box, close that box, and put it in the bottom of the closet and never talk of it again. Avoid going near it. We hide from it. We self-medicate against it. And yet, if we're honest with ourselves, these are the things that shape how we think of ourselves, think of others, think of life, what's possible and impossible. I mean, imagine being at the bottom of the towers with pieces of it falling off, and you say, "It's possible that I could go up there and save some people." Or, "It's possible I run away and hide." That these things in our lives color our glasses through which we see life to be dark. If you think about your life, all of the insults and injuries, the betrayals and abandonments, the failures and cheats and frustrations, the illnesses, infirmities, and death itself. If, rather than pretending that it's not so, rather than forever going through life wishing that things hadn't been the way they were, or are the way they are, or aren't going to be the way they're probably going to be, if we do like Jesus and turn and set our faces towards Jerusalem, directly into whatever is the matter, I didn't always practice this, but when I learned this spirituality, I found that just by facing it often robbed it of all the power it had over my soul. The grip of dread and fear. And more often than not, I did discover that there was another side, a different outcome that I could choose. As I said, insane, right? But there it is, Christian spirituality. And practicing or not can make all the difference between living your life as fully as you can as long as you have it, to being stuck in a living hell with a dead soul long before your body dies. I remember when I was a young chaplain, not long after September 11th at the Brigham, but I was called upon to visit people in the hospital who were not going to get better the way they wanted to get better. And I didn't know what to say. So I went to see my supervisor and I said, Ron, what in God's name am I supposed to do for these people? They know they're not going to be well, that they're not going to go home the way they want to go home. And they know that I know. I've read the doctor's report. So for me to go in there and pray for a miracle seems disingenuous at best. It makes me look like a fool, offering false hope, which is worse, my friends, than no hope. And Ron, who was a very soft man, said to me, Max, you are to go into that room and help each person reframe his or her situation so that she or he can make a realistic decision and can imagine what a realistic and achievable, hopeful next step looks like. You're there to help them imagine what would be good next that is possible. Not perfection or escape, but what is worth hoping for. And for some, it was for healing. For others, it was less pain. For others, it was to pick up the phone and apologize or to seek forgiveness from others. And for others, it was a good death. He said, that's what you do, Max. And that's Palm Sunday, walking into suffering and death. And that is our way of life as disciples, walking into the dark places of our lives and of our world, because this isn't all private. As disciples, we're supposed to face the dark places of poverty and discrimination and injustice and violence and oppression and war, and see where the hope is, where the helpers are, and be the helpers, and lead the charge forward into that. Amen.